Welcome to the January Conclave. Um, and in the conclave, we usually tackle some advanced topics. And I thought today was a very good time to start talking about animal biographies, especially because we have so many people from Backbed attending. And in Backbed, we're going to be doing more of animal biographies. And so I thought that it's a good time for us to discuss what it is and what its potential is, how to do it, how not to do it, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's start with a conversation, a quick check with all of you on what your thoughts are on what animal biographies mean. What do you understand by that? Yeah, generally, where are your thoughts on that phrase? What comes to your mind when we say animal biography? Have you read anything that you remember? Yeah, Hannah.
Yeah, I think it's like telling the story of like one particular animal, like or just like a human biography, just like kind of following their life and showcasing what's happening in their life.
Is there any you can think of?
Yeah, the one you just recommended, I watched it a couple of days ago on Netflix, My Octopus Teacher. So it follows the life of like one particular octopus. There isn't any preaching or anything. It's just showing the life of the octopus, showing this is what the octopus is doing, this is what's going on in her life, and that's just the whole thing. But it makes like a very powerful impact.
Yeah, yeah. I really like that one. If any of you have not watched it, you must. It's just like such an amazing thing on Netflix. I think it is on Netflix. It's called My Octopus
Yeah.
Teacher. It's a great animal biography, and especially for those of us who do the kind of work we do, I think it's an excellent thing to watch because not only is it such a great masterpiece in storytelling, but go look up their website as well. So they have like very interesting how they kind of segue from this movie to research and conservation and awareness and education and all of those, how they've kind of added all those into this project is just quite remarkable. So I would highly recommend it. Yeah, okay. So stories of animals could count as animal biographies. Anything else? Any of you have something that comes up to you on what is an animal biography or why we need it?
Yeah. So some stories that come up generally are the ones with like of tigers, like how we had Machli from Ranthambore. She was a famous tigress there. So I've come across this mainly like during safaris. I've noticed the naturalist or mainly the people taking you into the forest. They have names for them. They have their stories. So that's what's coming up for me.
I love that, right? So that's a very different form of animal biography that's not necessarily documented in a form that is perpetual, not necessarily like a historical documentation. It can be more of an oral tradition, um, much like we do have, especially in India, we have a lot of oral traditions, right? Story of so and so forth king in this area, and a lot of it is um, sort of just passed on orally. We're not necessarily um, writing it down. And I think animal biography can
I agree.
definitely take that form as well. So is somebody's audio not on mute? Or is it just me? So yeah, I think that's an interesting one as well that I will visit. But I first want to just take a few moments to hear you all out. So yeah, Roma.
Yeah, I just wanted to check. Like recently, I read this book called Judy, the book on the first prisoner of war dog. and this was um, mainly documented through the people that she stayed with, like during the wartime, and through their narrative, this story was formed. So, would that also kind of come as a biography?
Absolutely. So I think that's a very typical form of an animal biography. It's something that we will see a lot of when we start looking. Um, and and the truth is that quite frequently a lot of the storytelling is going to be from the human perspective. That's really the truth. But at least some of these stories, the protagonist is the animal. So the
Hmm.
animal is at least being seen, at least being individualized, rather than, oh yeah, there were a bunch of dogs that fought in the war, right? Like just a number. It's not that,
Yeah.
it's going beyond that to actually look at the animal. So
Hmm.
I think it very much would count as an animal biography. Um, and I think it has its value. So yeah, we can discuss more of that. Shubhra?
Most of these animal films, I mean, if you're watching these biographies and from our own experience, whenever we've interacted or had a relationship with an animal, there's a lot of growth and realizations that we also come to. So I think these biographies also will be able to reveal a lot about us and ourselves, our growth with the animal along their journey, which becomes our journey then.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, I mean, at least with me, I've seen that over the 6 years that I've had a lab at home, there has been a lot of, change of perspective, change of thought, understanding her, understanding my needs, all of it. So, I mean, I think these biographies will enrich both. I mean, the animal and the equation that we have with the animal.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that I talk about so frequently, right? The idea of the animal mirror, which is, I think, so much of our studies about animals, and the more we understand them, I think there are shocking revelations about ourselves that we realize, oh my God, okay, because their lives are not independent, they stand very, very dependent on ours. And the truth is that when anybody is dependent on us, um, very quickly, they are kind of in contact with our power as a species. We are extremely powerful as a species. No matter how disenfranchised we are in our own society, the truth is we are very powerful in a multi-species world. And that contact that they have with us always influences, um, always kind of reflects on how we utilize that power. And I think that can be very, very revealing to us on who we are then. We, yeah, it's quite interesting, It's the truth is, I think that we are more resilient than we imagine. We are more powerful than we imagine, and we are more cruel than we imagine. I think all of those aspects are true. And I think when we look at our contact with animals, frequently those things kind of come up, and it can be quite shocking. Okay, so in preparation for this conclave, there's been a really nice book that I've been reading that I think is going to be very powerful for all people doing backbed to read. So Saujanya was kind enough to find me this book. I don't know, Saujanya, if you've had a chance to start reading it, but I've been having a great time. It's called Animal Biography, Reframing Animal Life. So I'll share the PDF of the first chapter with everybody attending this conclave in case you want to read it. And then those of you who want to read more and want guidance through the reading, please feel free. We can have discussions around it. And I'm happy to read it along with you because it is a little difficult book to read, but some interesting things, right? So the book starts out by, and I've highlighted some quotes from it, which I think are very useful. So in this, he says, they say, We are not talking about the distant, dissecting, determinist kind of observation here. This is a typical thing that science does, right? It's distant. These, we are not part of the animal life, so we're studying them in a lab, or we're studying them from like a wildlife movie, but from a distance, more often than not in a lab. Deterministic, so dissecting and deterministic, like getting into a lot of minute details. It can be physical dissecting, which is very disturbing, but also sort of dissecting the topic, but also very deterministic. Science has this problem with being very deterministic. It's almost machine-like, looking at them like machines. So what he's saying is, with animal biographies, okay, somebody's audio is not off. I request that you put your audio on mute, please. Um, right. So what they say is, animal biographies, on the other hand, suspend rational correction and attempt to lose itself in the object. And I think that's lovely, right? You lose yourself in the object. In these moments, it seems almost inescapable to recognize within their play their individual, and we all know this when we talk about dogs, right? It's almost impossible not to recognize their individual personalities, tastes, characters, and forms of waywardness, yet taking animals seriously as individuals, and even more, attempting to substantiate and portray such individuality in scholarly terms, provides a daunting exercise. So I think what they're trying to highlight is, what we need is for us to start personalizing and individualizing these subjects, but the thing that I think is difficult to do is, how do you get taken seriously when you start doing this? And I think my octopus teacher has really done a really good job of it, and we should learn from it. But we can often get ridiculed for it, criticized for sort of anthropomorphizing, or being emotional, and so on and so forth. So the book goes on to say that while history is dominated by attempts that try to standardize, de-individualize, and automatize the behavior of animals, it also proves to be littered with records of exceptional lives of unusual animals. So they do bring up that there are animal biographies. It's not that they don't exist, but they're usually of exceptional animals. So, the dog that went to the moon, or some of the, I think, chimps that worked with Jane Goodall. So I think there are these, or Roma, the example that you gave. So I think we do have animal biographies, but they tend to be of really exceptional animals who have either done exceptional things for us or been like very strange. That is what it's limited to, but that is changing, and we're moving towards something else. So I think that's the first difference that I wanted to highlight. Animal behavior science, and this is what most other schools focus on, animal behavior science. It has a sort of typical trappings of science. It is reductionist, it's distancing, whereas with animal biographies, we're trying to go in a very different direction, which is to say, we're going to come close to them, we're going to get to know them, we're going to get to know their personality. And I like that phrase, right? Lose yourself in the object, sort of lose yourself in that story, as you try to write it. So that's the difference I wanted to highlight. So any of you have any thoughts on that? Any aspects of that difference between animal behavior science and biographies?
So I think the only thing that comes to my mind, like maybe the nervousness around biographies, is sometimes when you're observing the life, you feel that you know better, and you're trying to put your perspective right there, which you need to kind of stay away from. And that is like, I feel that is going to be like one thing which I would be struggling with, like staying apart, away from adding the perspective and let it be from
Yeah.
how it's unfolding.
Yeah. So I think, you're kind of really coming into the typical challenges of animal biographies. And I think, definitely when we try to tell the story of another individual, particularly when the other individual doesn't actually have words to use and we are using our words, right? I mean, think about this. Just think about this. Let's say that you are narrating a story of something that happened between you and your sibling or you and your parent, and the other person is not in the room, right? So you may be
Right.
talking to your friends. Maybe you're even annoyed with this interaction and you are narrating this. This happened and this happened and this happened. What are the chances that the story is going to be exactly the same if the other person narrated it? Chances are it's going to be different. We are going to perceive things differently. We are going to say things differently. We're going to experience things differently. And at the end of the day, we are the ones doing the narration. So the truth is that it's our perspective and our experience of it. And I think um, we as a school are very conscious of this, right? We are very conscious that we want to give them a voice, we want to give animals a voice. But I think despite being conscious about it, this is not going to be that easy. I know we had that conversation yesterday a little bit where you're narrating a story, and I asked you to say, don't add things to it, stick to the bits
Right.
that you're observing.
Right.
And I think that is typically a challenge that we're going to come across where we come in, we see something, and then we don't know where to draw the line. Very quickly, we're going to try and interpret this based on what we know and say, this is what I think is happening. This is what I think the other one is thinking. This is what is going on in their mind. To be able to take a step back from that and not to do that and yet give them a voice, that gets difficult. That balance can get difficult. So in fact, in the book, they do call this out, and they call out a lot of these things, and they have a lot of case studies. That's why it's an interesting book. They say animal biography entails exactly the attempt to account for their individuality without having to read their minds, reconstruct their feelings, or infer their intentions. Now, we can't help it, but we have to be aware of this. You are being tasked to tell their story, but not make assumptions about what they may be feeling, not make assumptions about what their perspective may be. This will get challenging. And I think one of the key tools for us to remember when we try to tell these stories is reflexivity, to be able to say, well, I think this is what the dog is feeling based on this. So you can give your observations, so on and so forth. But recognizing and acknowledging, but it's still what I think.
Right.
It's not fact, right? I think I have interpreted it based on my observations and based on my life experience, my biases, so on and so forth.
Mhm.
I have arrived at this. So now I'm going to ask you, biases are usually something to do with blind spots, right? You are so biased that you can't see another side. I'm actually now asking you to try and tease out what your blind spot is. This is going to be very difficult. So this kind of ties back to the idea that we discussed earlier, right? It may start exposing to you who you are. Why is that you see something a certain way? Why do I see it that way? And um, it's because of experiences I've been through, because of the fears that I have. And so there's some deep thinking that's going to be happening while you're writing these biographies, which is not necessarily pleasant. But don't send your therapist after me, please. She asked me to think about it. It's a choice. It's a choice. Okay. Um, so I think I will ask you guys what do you think about it. But before that, I just want to read another piece from this book. that says that let's also not forget that when we write animal biographies, the truth is that you're not actually writing their story, right? What you're doing is you're actually writing about your own experience of the other animal as an individual. How you are experiencing that animal as an individual is what you're writing about. So don't lose sight of that. Of course, you're layering in and enriching that story with their personalities, idiosyncrasies, and trying to have the sense of self for them, recognizing them as individual selves, and also bringing in our own desire that we want to tell their story. That's our desire, right? We want to recognize them as individuals, we want them to be seen as individuals, we want to tell their story. So that desire, along with our experience, along with how we experience them as individuals, is what we're trying to add up. And this is kind of really complicating what an animal biography should contain, right? Okay. So, what are your thoughts on this so far, on the kind of challenges that you're going to come across, or how you're going to be navigating this space? How are you going to be writing? Your thoughts. And at any point, if you're feeling like, oh my God, this sounds impossible, you can talk about that too.
I think it will be very useful to go further and to explore more about ourselves and our view of our dogs, and I really like it.
Yeah. It is definitely going to be very useful, right? It is very powerful. The truth is that it's very powerful, what we're talking about. Even as we discuss it here, I can tell that, this is going to be very powerful. But it's going to be difficult. Yeah, it is. 100%. Yeah. Sajanya?
I think one part of it, and I think we have spoken about it in other projects that we've been doing, is the storytelling part of it, because at the end of it, when we are, it also depends on which audience you're catering to, right? Like, is it a technical paper with, like research and like more technical words? Is it for like common people, laymen who are consuming that story? So part of it is also what is the background and the audience that we are looking at when we are writing these stories, because I've been wanting to write stories about Laddu and Lady, because they are like the relationship, and again my experience of them, it's so, like, I do want to talk about it, but I think, like, how to make it interesting as a story, but also keep in mind to not get carried away about and I think we've spoken about this as well in terms of caricaturing the character in question, which is probably our dog. So I think these are some challenges that I think I will face, because storytelling is not probably my strongest suit. But also, like, the audience, how do you actually convey, what do you want to convey through the story? Is this a story about this individual? Is it some like a everyday story about the street dog whom I'm sharing this life with? Like, what is the, so I think all of that, fleshing these parts of the story, I think is where I feel it's going to be a lot more challenging. Of course, morphosizing is something that you have already spoken about, and I think we get blamed quite a bit for that. But I think larger challenges are, of course, like the storytelling and like fleshing out that narrative, I think.
Yeah. So, that's a lot of ground you've covered. So yeah, I mean, anthropomorphizing is, of course, that's the lowest hanging fruit. That's what we get accused of all the time. And I think that one is probably a little easier to deal with, because I think we can come back with science, right? Saying, hey, look, science shows that this is not my imagination. So for instance, let's say the dog, it looks like the dog feels this way. And then you can say, but it is not anthropomorphizing if to talk about dogs' feelings, because, and then there's so much evidence. Okay, animals experience feelings, we have evidence of it. Dogs experience feelings, we have evidence of it. We even have MRI evidence that dogs experience feelings and emotions, right? So there is all this evidence that says animals experience feelings. Therefore, I am not far-fetched in assuming that there's a feeling in this dog, and therefore I want to discuss this feeling. So that's how you can bypass that and get yourself a license to now talk about the feelings. Get yourself a license to explore feelings, saying that, that is not far-fetched, it's not anthropomorphizing. And I think one of the things that we will do is argument of anthropomorphizing will come up so frequently that we can have like these really nice collection of resources that we use repeatedly to make the argument, to the point where I think by the time we're done, this should become a boilerplate for us, right? Saying, hey, don't accuse us of anthropomorphizing. Here is all the evidence. Go read it, go away. We don't want to address this anymore. I think that might become like first principles for us. But for the rest of it, I think it's I think valid points. So again, I'm going to go back to the book, and it's interesting. When we talk about what kind of form biographies take, and we're talking about your audience, right? The truth is that biographies, and historically, when we look at animal biographies, they can take any form, and your audience can be anybody, and being aware of that is critical. So in the book, they talk about encyclopedic accounts, lyrical verses, memoirs. You can write it in the form of poetry, you can write it in the form of a paper, you can make a movie like, your my teacher Octopus. I was talking to Ahana about it. It could even be an Instagram account, right? Like Humans of New York type of a thing, right? Streeties of Chennai, or just one streetie, the dog that we've been working with, Simran. Simran could have an Insta account, and it could just be stories of her. So it could take any format, and I think it's useful for us to think about the audience. Who is the audience? Who and Ahana and I did have that conversation quite a bit. Who are we trying to talk to with what we're trying to do on this project? And what we're doing with Ahana is the project Backward. All of you guys will have to do a project. We'll have to have this conversation. So there were questions like, is it all Bach's people who have done 101 and are interested in applying these ideas into their dogs? Is it people in the market out there who have heard of Bugs, not really done 101, but are interested? So are we trying to prove to them our methods work? Or is it the world in general who has never heard of Bugs, couldn't care a damn, and we are saying, hey, here's a new thing to try out? Or is it backbed students who are going to be doing biographies, and so we tell them, hey, this is how biographies can look? Who is the audience? Look at how many audiences I have already called out in such a short period of time, right? So who is your audience? And you may not have to write any literature for some of them. You may not have to be apologizing for anthropomorphizing in some of them. If you have an Insta account for Simran, nobody may even care whether you're anthropomorphizing or no. What they probably care is, what is Simran up to? What is that dog up to? And that's really what they probably care about. And boring them with, hey, Tinbergen's paper says so and so, like it's completely irrelevant, right? So I think finding out who the audience is quite important. And also something that Ahana brought up, and I'm kind of, now it's a nice time to bring it up, is whose story are you telling, right? So it's not, a biography is not necessarily of a single animal. It can be of a collective as well. So there are some collective biographies too, or it could be situating the individual within the collective. So here is a dog, a streetie, among many other streeties, and I'll tell the streetie story, but I'm also trying to tell the stories of streeties in general by telling this. So I think that's also important for us to realize, are we telling a bigger picture? There's an interesting quote here where they say, hold on, let me try to find this together. Are we trying to lump all the animals together, or are we trying to separate them? There was one, I can't find that quote now, where they say that, you can also kind of present this individual as slightly different from the rest of the group, rest of the species, recognizing that, yes, your species has a history, the world has the history, but you have a history, and presenting you as different from your group and individualizing you. And what is the point of that? Why are you doing that? And one thing that comes up with dogs also is the intimate interlacing of the book talks about this interlacing of the lives of animals and humans. So it's so close knit that it's very difficult not to talk about the life of the dog without talking about your own life. So what aspect of yourself do you bring in? Where does you stop and the animals start? And this is an idea that we talk about, and we will do this in Lives of Streeties also. I talk a lot about this, about the idea of co-becoming, that it's almost impossible to write their story without writing your story. So you'll have to write both of it. And if you're writing your story, there are also, and in your story, right? If you're writing your story, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You don't have, you say, hey, I was in pain, and nobody is going to say, where is the proof for that? Go to hell, I was in pain, right? Like, I don't have to prove to anybody that I was in pain. I don't need a doctor's certificate to prove to anybody that I was in pain. So that kind of objectivity goes away, subjectivity comes in very heavily. But if in doing so, you are now going to have to really bring up a lot of honesty around how you feel about things. The second you start getting a little dishonest, it kind of shows very badly. So you'll have to be very, very honest about it. I don't know, Saujanya, if you've seen, but if you log into Moodle now, and if you ping me and ask me later, I've started something for all the students, which is the idea of thick descriptions. So thick descriptions are basically, and we can do another conclave on thick descriptions, where you are building your material to write the biography. So that's the research, the collection, where you are sitting down, you had an encounter with the dog, you come back and you're like, okay, what all can I remember about this whole thing? Let me write down everything, and then I'll sit and try to think of how do I actually present this. So I think that's a great starting point without having to get stuck on your end goal, without having to get stuck on, okay, whom am I presenting this to? How literature or videos, or how do I prove myself and my stories? Instead of getting stuck with all that, I think you can start collecting data and information very quickly with thick descriptions, just data dump. Like, just, I went at this time, it was raining, I met the dog, this is what happened. The dog looked this way, the dog felt this way, I felt this way, I met this human, this is how the human seemed to have felt, lots of feelings. Anything else, in terms of, there's a lot of firecrackers today, it was raining, thunderstorms, very hot, very cold. Anything else in terms of what may have been going on in your life? I was running late, traffic was bad, so on and so forth. You can write all of those down, and then you finish writing it, and then you zoom out and you're like, okay, I have a lot of detail to write now. And how I write about it, I don't know. So for instance, with your streeties, right, Laddu and Lady, and maybe I will do this with you guys as well, is when something happens and you want to write the story, just write it down as a thick description. Don't bother too much about who you're going to tell the story to and what, and so on and so forth. Maybe just note down what happened, how you felt, almost like a personal diary. And then we can pull it up and sit down and say, okay, this looks interesting. How do we use this story? And maybe something can surface from it. It's just a way to pass that blocker, if you get mentally blocked on that. I have rambled on about a lot. Do you guys have any thoughts on this? Caroline, you've said, and it can become useful with other people like customers later too. It adds a personal note, and I often feel that if you give a talk and add your personal experience as well as just science facts, the audience can remember better what you had been talking about. Okay, so here's the thing, right? I give a lot of talks, and people rarely remember any of the science I talk about. They will remember the stories, they will remember the time they spent with me, and the science, they only remember it as, you mention some science. That's it, right? Like they don't remember what the study was about. Of course, they don't remember the author and all that. Forget it, right? They don't even remember what the study was about, right? So I wrote my book like so many years ago. It got published, what, like 4 years ago? And all the reviews, if you go on Amazon and look at all the reviews, they're all great. Everybody's like, such a great book. So well referenced books. It's such a great book. You want to know a secret? The book doesn't have a single reference. I forgot to print it. So So now that it is being translated, all the translators are like, hey, where are the references? And I'm like, oh, right. I didn't put them in. So I'm compiling them now. I did my research. Okay. I really did my research. I do have all the references. I just haven't put it down as links. I'm doing it now. I'm putting it on a website. We're kind of started working on it. But it surprises me that nobody seems to have realized for 4 years that there are no references, there is no science there that I've not presented. I've just said there is science and just left it at that. But still, people are able to remember Nishi's stories, they're able to remember Chiru's stories, they will recount to me Uttam's stories, and they have no problem remembering any of that. And so I think even when we talk to customers and clients, or anybody for that matter, I think stories can be very powerful. Even if it isn't with a direct intent of changing minds, it even could be, I'm going to tell this on social media. Whoever wants to listen can listen, right? Just putting our stories down, I think can be powerful. Adding science, I think in some contexts can give us credibility. So, for instance, if you're trying to push a paper that professionals are going to read, useful to put science in there. But if you're trying to gain an audience of non-professionals, ditch the science, right? Just tell the story, and focus on what aspect of the story you want to tell. Maybe the aspect that you want to tell is not the sciencey part of it, but the personal connection, right? So, for instance, if you're talking about loss of agency, have you experienced in your life loss of agency? How did that feel? Write about that. And that's honest and true, and nobody can write it better than you, right? Because it's your pain story. How did loss of agency feel? So maybe you can write that and then write the story of the dog that you want to highlight. That may be a way to bring them alive, is to draw parallels into people, your own lives. You are the expert of you, so nobody can do better than you. So I definitely think that that's useful tactic or a strategy in writing biographies. All right. Any other thoughts so far? So, a few more things from the book. Please feel free to keep typing in your thoughts if you get them, or ask questions. Also, feel free to disagree with me. Yeah, it doesn't bother me that much. um, I saw something interesting in the book that said, for historians, the method of biography has been a long-standing tool in recounting the past. So when we talk about the usefulness of biographies, right, we can talk about biographies as in how they can convince people of things in the now. But we shouldn't also forget that biographies have been used in very powerful ways to reconstruct all of history, what was happening in society at that time, what was the culture at that time. All of these have been reconstructed through biographies. So you may feel like you're telling a really simple story, but you may be telling the story of the world itself by talking about your dog. So that can be very powerful and something to consider. Um, so I really like this phrase. It says micro historical approach and history of everyday life. So it's a really nice way to think about history of everyday life. How does that look like? So the dog does something. Is there a history that it is revealing? Yeah, it reveals a history of the dog's past experiences, your past experiences. Your past experiences are built on the experiences of your parents, of your the culture you were brought up in. The place that you take your dog for a walk is a remnant of the history of your country. So there is so much that you can tie together, so much you can talk about, so much social commentary that you can talk about. I would highly encourage you to look at that too, right? We are not animal behavior school. I think this is well established at this point, right? So it's not necessary for us to stop with, okay, this is what the dog, this is the dog story. Tracing that back to what does it tell about human stories, what does it tell about human history, and helping us to understand ourselves. How did I become who I am through this kind of tracking of history of everyday objects, history of everyday activities, and using that as a form of reflexivity can also be a powerful tool and worth going into. What you're saying, that story will be more valuable, and it's okay. You can make it powerful that way. It doesn't have to stop with, does it help this dog? That's one way to look at it. But does it help us uncover things about ourselves? Who said our job has to stop with animals? Who said that? Right? Why can't we allow ourselves to have a bigger influence, have a bigger conversation? We should not have what is the phrase for that? Imposter syndrome. Have you heard that phrase, imposter syndrome? Like, I feel like I'm not good enough for it. I find that a lot of people working with dogs do have that. I'm not good enough to talk about politics. I'm not good enough to talk about history. I'm not good enough to talk about, the history of humankind and natural history. I'm just working with dogs. In fact, I myself do that a lot. When people ask me, what do you do? I say, I just work with dogs. Just work with dogs. But this is such a powerful conversation that we can have, and I would highly encourage you to not replicate my attitude on this. Like, just it's okay to be big and ambitious with it. The book also does very nicely talk about enriching biographies. What would you think of? What can you use to enrich biographies, animal stories? How can you make them richer? So you're telling a story, you saw a dog do something cute, and you're going to tell that story. How do you make it richer?
You gave the example of the Instagram page as a way for a biography. I mean, I think photographs or right like or things like that like to connect to it at an emotional level. Written words certainly and description can go a long way, but I think also when I think, Sindor, of your blog about the lives of some of the streeties that live at the farm, and I think about some of the photos and videos you put up, I think that enriches the storytelling process because I see them and some of that personality comes out in an image.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think photographs and videos can really enrich the biographies and really add depth to that story and bring those characters alive. Yeah, agreed. Ahana, you have typed the history of the dog, where they came from, who has been in their lives, what could have made them the way they are. Yeah, like the psychological history, the health history. What about natural history? What makes a dog a dog? A dog scavenging, Simran scavenging in the dustbin, is telling the story of the natural history of dogs. Right? And if you compare it to the recent article that I wrote for the Kunur and Co guys, I wrote this article where I spoke about kinship between humans and dogs. If you haven't read it, please read it. It's a nice article that talks about kinship between humans and dogs and how we co-evolved and how we survive as a species because of them. Something as simple as Simran, the streetie, eating from the dustbin, eating from garbage, tells the world the story of humans and dogs and how humans survived. So you could add natural history. Anything else you could add? Ethology, ethological explanations. Scientists have found this. Scientists have observed this. And, I'm also observing it. This is something that I have been asked to collaborate on a few projects like this, where the scientists are bringing in the scientific explanation, I'm bringing in the stories. So I don't know whether I'm making them richer or they're making me richer. Which way this enrichment is going, I think it's very mutually beneficial. But you can have animal behavior science, but more importantly, ethological approaches, philosophy. You can have that would probably be the hardest to read if you add it in philosophy. You'd probably have the smallest audience. But if it's right for the audience, you can add philosophy. History in general, you can add, making it richer. For instance, one of the biographies that I'm reading from the book right now is a fairly popular Japanese biography of a dog. Any of you know, can you think of a Japanese biography of a dog? Yeah, Hachiko, right? Yeah, Hachiko. So Hachiko's is a great story to read. And on the face of it, it's a biography of a dog who missed his human and kept going back to the Shibuya station to meet him every evening. His human passed away and died when he was at work, a professor. Hachiko's story, a deeper dive on it, actually is very interesting. Hachiko became popular when Japan was trying to carve out its national identity and national pride, and show its identity as different from the Western world. And so they wanted to encourage people not having, they wanted to use the native dogs of Japan to stand for what are called Japanese values. And Japanese pride, a lot of the values that were trying to be showcased at that time, high on that list was loyalty. What a great story, right? For loyalty, what better mascot than Hachiko? And so Hachiko, being a native dog, a native Japanese dog, became a great poster child for the story to be told. Funnily enough, there is a lot of debate of whether Hachiko was actually a pure native dog or he was a mixed breed dog. And there's also debate around whether Hachiko is really coming back for the human, because he had turned into a stray dog. And but he was also quite popular in that place, and he was getting apparently a lot of kebabs at the station, to the point where when he died, they found skewers inside him. He had been eating everything. And so was he just coming back for that? We don't know, but Hachiko's story, when you actually do his entire biography, you start realizing that he was used in certain ways for national pride, for some national interests. And that's his full story. It's not just, and that isn't even his full story, but more of the story. So you could actually explore Japan's history with and Japan's relationship with its national identity. What does that identity mean? How do they feel about street dogs, stray dogs, whatever it is, so on and so forth. All of that could be added into Hachiko's story, making it a more powerful story. So you can definitely add a lot to make biographies powerful. But you have to think about that, right? What else do you add? And of course, reflexivity, adding in your personal experience. How would you experience it? How would you, for instance, if you were writing about Hachiko, I don't think we would write about Hachiko, but if you were to, and if you were writing about the loss itself, you could write about your own experience of grief if you've experienced something parallel. Or if or you could be writing about another example of human beings whose suffering was utilized for political posturing. right? Somebody suffered from somebody, and then some group comes from somewhere and says, okay, your suffering cannot go in vain. This is a commentary on the political system. So we are going to talk about you. And it's not never really about that person, right? They've started talking about this person in order to forward their political agenda. So if you have experienced something like that, then maybe that can be an angle that you can bring in when you write Hachiko's story and make the biography a bit richer. So those are ways in which you could think of kind of um, making making the biographies itself more enriched. Um, we are this book says that, by writing biographies, the individuals become visible as social entities rather than just cognitive actors. So they're playing a role in society itself and recognizing that role. And if you have done sociology, you can even do actor mapping and things like that, which I don't want to get into right now. So yeah, those are some of the ways I can think of in enriching biographies. Do you have any thoughts on that? If you don't have any, I'm just going to wrap up with a few last things. So the book actually has a really nice example of a guy called Hoffman who writes about his cat. And he writes about how until the mid 19th century, conventional ideas of cats were very derogatory, that, they were kind of nasty, seen more as a nuisance, and so on and so forth. And then started some literary works representing cats, writing their stories basically. And the book says how this particular story that he features in one of the chapters really changed people's views on cats themselves, saying that the conventional ideas were seen as biased and prejudiced, and henceforth cats came to be seen, promoted as affectionate companion animals, and were extolled as underestimated and misrepresented. According to the cat's most prominent zoological advocate in Germany, the cat used to be a completely misunderstood creature. The cat, he writes, is nothing less than false, but on the contrary, very candid. The cat is just as little deceitful as the dog, and never scratches while she's coaxing. Rather, she's loyal, devoted to her masters. What she lacks most of all, I like the statement the best. What she lacks most of all is a loving education on the part of the human to make her an entirely amiable animal. It's a very different kind of writing from what happened a little prior to it. So I think that's the power of biographies. They can really move us, really highlight the individual and say, okay, that's I know people talk about that, but that's not what's coming up. Um, and the book says the alternative to crude scientific objectivism, right? So we talk about how science tends to objectify and reduce, try to make things just numbers. That is something that biographies have a way to kind of oppose. And it says biographies are special because of their receptiveness. And this is important. And I know, Ahana, you and I had a brief chat about this. Biographies are powerful because of their receptiveness to the anecdotal. So an anecdote now doesn't become just an anecdote. Science does that, right? Anecdote is just an anecdote, whereas biography, it's not just an anecdote. We're receptive to it. We really want that anecdote. It's transgression of the delineation between science and art. I really like this. We're talking about storytelling. This is art. Where does science come in here? And we bring the two together. And so it has, I think, the ability to be really comfortable between these two spaces. And the space it leaves, so differentiation and deviance, individuality, right? Differentiation and deviance hold specific promises for human animal studies. So this book and many others are talking about biographies actually being very, very promising for the future of human animal studies and revealing animals. And what was really exciting for me is also how much this book emphasizes on biographies frequently are about interspecies relationships, And to write a biography, uh, I really like this quote. It says, this dimension of a shared life is significant. To write a biography, you need a shared life. And so he talks about this. He talks about friendship with animals. So think about writing about your friendship and not about writing about a subject that you don't know, right? So this stems from narrating their lives as our friends. We are narrating the lives of animals as our friends through collective biographies. So you're not writing their biography, you're writing your collective biography. The emphasis is not on representation, but mutual. This is interesting. It's not representation, it's mutual production and transformation. He talks about hybrid communities that does not just enable the description of animal lives, but you're not just describing it, but through particular and personal relationships, through mediation of the process of storytelling, interpretation, and interaction, it actively produces animal personhood and more complex and dynamic forms of interiority and identity. So I think it's really important for us to recognize, especially the way we live with dogs, and especially because we're talking about dogs, the fact that we are actually co-producing our lives itself with them. We're not just writing about something that we observed somewhere else. We are living it. We are living it on a day-to-day basis. We are shaping it, and they are living it too. So we have to look at them. They talk about the idea of looking at them as co-authors of the biographies, which I think is a pretty cool way to look at it, right? It's, you're not writing it, they're also authors. You're writing about both your lives. He talks about, I think these are useful things to think about when you're writing a biography. Think about the animal, what it might be like to smell, feel, see, and taste the world of animals by conceiving animal life and experiences in the mode of the first person. So sometimes people go to extremes to do this. I know that there was somebody who wrote about civet cats, civet coffee, this poop coffee that they talk about in Malaysia, Kapi Luwak. It's made from civet cat poop, and they're kept in really bad conditions, and they're fed caffeine all the time. And this lady decided to write a biography of the cats, and she did a very interesting experiment. She went to Malaysia after seeing the civet cats. She locked herself up in the room and got on a purely caffeine diet. She had nothing but coffee for several days to see what would happen to her. And then she wrote from that experience. So she's trying to understand what it feels like if you're on a purely caffeine diet, trying to gain the experience that the animal is gaining. Now, I am not suggesting that you go to the park and sniff other dogs' butts. That's not the suggestion. But I think this is something we do well at Bucks, right? You start with the pulse module itself and you do this very well, and I want you to do more of it. Pulse module, the last exercise, all of you do this, right? Listen to the sounds around. How does that feel? Smells around. How does that feel? Trying to, and remembering, oh my God, the dog can smell so much more than this. If the smell is bothering me, how could this be impacting the dog? What is my dog smelling? What is my dog hearing? What is my dog seeing? Seeing, you can try a little bit. For instance, get down on your knees and see how the world looks from that height. How does that look? So a little bit you can try, but that's an interesting way to gain insight. And also remember that this whole thing hinges on the narrative. There's a premise that the animals have a perspective on and interest in situations and events. So something is happening in the house. The dog has a perspective on it. There's an interest in that. So highlighting that this is usually not written about in animal behavior science. They're not seen as agents. They're not seen as having an opinion. They're not seen as having an interest that, okay, the outcome of this is going to be this, an interest in the day-to-day activity. So recognizing what could be the interest of the dog, what could be the opinion of the dog, asking these questions could lead you to more things to write about. You already know these answers. I'm not telling you anything new here, right? But the questions you can ask yourself so that you have things to write about, you can put it down, pen it down, and then take a step back and look at it and say, okay. So at the end of the day, what it is, there are two things, right? One is you have to try to put yourself in the animal's position and imagine other senses and creative realms of those senses. If they're able to see that, if they're able to hear that, how could life feel? So that's one kind of questioning that you have to ask yourself. The other question that you ask yourself, or the other thing that you try to do is construct ways that imagine how animals go about constructing their world. They are actors. They have agency. How do they go about constructing their world? What do they have control on? Your dogs are probably going about constructing your world by influencing you, looking cute to you, looking lazy to you, looking hungry to you, so on and so forth, right? So how do they go about constructing their world? Asking that question also can reveal a lot of answers. So you're going to bring all of this together in terms of the content, especially thick descriptions. You're going to enrich it with ethology, history, multimedia, so on and so forth. You're going to think of where you're going to present this, who you're going to present it to, and therefore what is the right additional jam you need to put between the layers, right? To make that layer cake that ends up being a biography. So that is biographies, animal biographies. We'll come back to it, don't worry. So go back, unpack it. You shouldn't be terrified. I think you should really be excited about it. I am, and I am very eager to help you all to do this better and better. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'll send you the first chapter. I've gone through many of them, so I'm sure you'll understand the first chapter. So read the book and then see if you can get your hands on some of the other chapters or other resources mentioned and go from there. Also, please share with each other great examples of animal biography, right? And I don't mean animal biography as in what is written with philosophy, like not that style, but like My Octopus Teacher, or the book that Roma you mentioned. Any Instagram accounts, there are so many that are animal biographies, but good ones that pack a punch, not ones that um, just do a voiceover for the dog and that's just your imagination of what's going on. Like that's not it, right? That those kinds are not useful for us, but really ones that can pack a punch. You've seen something really powerful. It can be moving. It can change people's minds about animals in question. Please share those kind of things. Let's see how they are producing it. Let's see how we can produce things that are similar. Set yourself goals for how you're going to tell these stories, and let's try to do that. How does that sound? Yeah. All right. Sajanya, sorry, you missed that boat. But you graduated already. But we're going to do animal biographies for the research that we're doing as well. We're going in that direction for research as well. And so I think this is good reading for you as well. So let's all kind of get on this bandwagon. I really want us at the end of the day to be telling a lot more stories, whatever way it's easy for you, right? But we have to find ways to tell more stories. You may be a silent storyteller. There are silent stories too, you know that, right? There are silent movies, there are silent plays. You don't need words to tell stories. You don't need photographs to tell stories. So, whatever you don't want to do, you don't have to do, and you can still tell the story of the dog that's asking you to give their voice a platform. And you can find a way to do that powerfully. And I encourage you to use your time with us to do that. Yeah. All right, there's a lot to digest, so watch the video again if you want to. Put your questions in the comments or ask them directly. Backbed guys, we'll be talking more about this anyways. The others who are not in Backbed, thanks for joining. Usually conclave topics tend to be a little bit more uh, advanced. AMAs are where we discuss a bit more of 101, but love your participation. And I look forward to next month. And if you have any topics for next month, please send it in. Happy to discuss. I did talk about happiness in the last conference. Last thing that I spoke about. So we can talk about happiness if you like. I'm prepared for that. I'm going to be talking about well-being in another conference, so we can talk about happiness and well-being or something like that. Or if you have anything else that you want me to deep dive on, please ask me. Let's do that together. Okay.